Hello everyone. In this presentation, the last 400 years part 4, we'll look at the following the First World War. In this century we had a Second World War. Why was that? We see basically after the First World War, it was called a war to end all wars, but it was not that way at all. The reason for that is because the able nations won the war, but actually they put huge war debts on the defeated nations. So this is like kicking the enemy when it was down. So it wasn't, these are crippling war debts, and particularly Germany, they couldn't cope with this. The economy was so low. So it was only a matter of time before they rebelled against this. And it took a person like Adolf Hitler to raise up his Nazi party, National Socialists. And this basically was the cause of the Second World War. Now, look at the nations of this. It was Germany, Japan and Italy, and Satan's side. And God's side is the USA, Britain and France. Now, the satanic Jesus is Adolf Hitler. His ideology was National Socialism. His goal was world dominion. Now, it's very interesting. There's many similarities between Hitler and Jesus. Both were single idealists. Both were great speakers. Hitler was a great orator. People really studied his speeches even today. His audiences were mesmerized by him. He had so much influence. Jesus, likewise, is a great speaker. The Pharisees often tried to trick him, but he always outsmarted them. Both Jesus and Hitler, there were many attempts at Hitler's life, but he always mysteriously escaped death. Jesus, likewise, there's many attempts at Jesus' life, but he always somehow mysteriously evaded these. So it's like an evil spiritual world was protecting Hitler, but a good spiritual world was protecting Jesus. And both men, there's a mystery surrounding the body of Hitler. Even to this day, it's not certain where his body is. And likewise, Jesus, his body was never found. Now, the Second World War happened. This war involved every continent. Japan already occupied Korea, but it invaded Manchuria, it was a province of China. Italy, they invaded Ethiopia. And when Germany invaded Poland, Britain declared war on Germany, and this became the beginning of the Second World War. But you can see all the nations, all the continents, all the races, were involved. Asia, Africa, Europe. It was a world war, because this is really Satan's attack on the world. We really need to see it that way. And Hitler was the satanic Jesus. It's an attempt to try to take over the world. But the able side could not prevent the war itself, but they did actually defeat the Cain side in the war. So this is a very important step. Now the Korean War, soon after this, 5 years after that, a situation occurred where the communists invaded Korea. They took all of Korea, basically. But Douglas MacArthur, who was the Governor General at that time, stationed in Japan, he did an incredible, famous Incheon landing, and he pushed all the communists back to the borders of China. Now, when the Cain side starts a war, the able side has the responsibility to defend the world. But in this case, what happened was there was a conflict between Douglas MacArthur and President Truman at that time, and it's a disastrous thing to happen because Truman fired MacArthur actually 1 year after this war, in the middle of this, in 1951. But when this happened, then unfortunately the communists came back and retook territory that was already liberated by MacArthur. So this is a serious failure on the able side, and this led the world to be in the situation as it is today. In North Korea and South Korea, they're still at a state of war, and it reflected in the whole world in what we call the Cold War. This lasted until 1993. The satanic Lord of the Second Advent was Joseph Stalin. His ideology was communism. His goal is world dominion. And so it's very important to understand Hitler and Stalin, they were allies actually at the beginning of the war, because they're both actually socialists. But it's the same force of Satan trying to take over the world. When Satan realized he couldn't completely do it through Hitler, then he moved on to Joseph Stalin, and he did succeed. He succeeded in taking half the world at that time, in territory-wise. But this can only last until 40 years, until 1993. So the Korean War, in effect, was the Third World War. So from the providential point of view, the First World War was a condition representing the first blessing, but also it's a condition that the Lord of the Second Advent could be born on the earth. As we've seen in the presentation on the parallels of history, the second coming of Christ was born between 1917 and 1930. With this a condition where he could be born. Now, the Second World War, between 1939 and 1945, that was a foundation for the second blessing, like a second temptation to the world. And the defeat of the Cain-type nations enabled as a foundation for the second coming of Christ could begin his mission. Now, World War III, that's like the third blessing or third temptation. That should be the end of it. The end of it were the completion of the second coming of Christ's mission, which means the kingdom of heaven on the earth. But unfortunately what has happened, Satan invaded, and it has become a prolonged war. It's a prolonged war we call the Cold War. And it lasted 40 years until 1993. And so to understand this, we see in further presentations, we see what actually happened after 1993 and why the world is the way it is today. Why did China emerge as a very dominant force in the world today? And Russia, it was the Soviet Union, it became democratic for a while. Why did it suddenly appear again as a totalitarian state, very similar as it was before, as the Soviet Union? Why they're allies with China? The state of the world will understand this from further lectures, but this was the purpose of the three world wars. And in the next presentation we'll look at the second coming of Christ. The Antichrist comes before the true Christ, and these three persons need to come. And they came, and they tried to take over the world, and they could not completely do that. Now the true Christ, true Messiah comes. So we'll look at this in the next presentation. The second coming of Christ, we'll look at how, when, and where that will take place. Anyway, thank you for hearing this presentation. Thank you very much.